Hey, you finally found what you were looking for. As you listen to my voice and feel the gentle frequencies in the background, you'll notice your body beginning to sink deeper into your bed. Each breath slower, each muscle softer, and with every word, your thoughts become quieter. You can let go now. You can rest. This is your journey. Welcome to Dreams of Duty. Now, before we begin this journey, take a moment just to breathe. Breathe in slowly. Feel the air fill your chest and breathe out, letting everything go. Again, breathe in and breathe out. Each time, a little deeper, a little calmer. With every breath, your body softens, your thoughts drift further away, and the world outside becomes distant and quiet. You are safe here. You are calm. You are ready to dream. At the end of the Second World War, the world found itself standing on the precipice of a new, unprecedented era of tension and uncertainty. While the guns of Europe had fallen silent and the ruins of cities still smoked from the devastation wrought by years of total war, a different kind of conflict was already beginning to take shape. This was not a war defined by conventional armies clashing on battlefields, nor by nations declaring open hostilities in the manner of the past. Instead, it was a war of ideologies, of visions for the future of humankind, a struggle that would see the globe divided into two spheres of influence. On one side stood the United States, emerging from the Second World War as a superpower, possessing unparalleled economic strength, technological capability, and nuclear monopoly. On the other side rose the Soviet Union, a nation that had endured unimaginable suffering and loss, yet emerged as a colossal military and industrial power, determined to spread its vision of communism across continents. The Cold War was born not with the firing of weapons, but in the complex interplay of politics, economics, propaganda, espionage, and psychological warfare. Every decision, every alliance, and every act of diplomacy or coercion would be scrutinized for its potential to shift the balance of power in a world where the ultimate consequences of miscalculation could be annihilation. The origins of this struggle, however, can be traced far back into the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution transformed the very fabric of human civilization. Steam engines roared to life in factories, machine tools multiplied production capabilities, and new methods of manufacturing turned entire nations into engines of economic might. Wealth and power became concentrated in the hands of those who could control these technological marvels, while vast swathes of the population endured harsh working conditions, long hours, and grinding poverty. It was in this climate of industrial inequality and social unrest that thinkers like Karl Marx began to articulate a vision of a radically different world, one in which the exploitation of labor by capital would be abolished and a society based on communal ownership and equality could replace the entrenched hierarchies of wealth and privilege. Marx's theories did not remain confined to the pages of his writings. they would find practical, revolutionary application in Russia, a country beset by centuries of autocracy, military failures, and social upheaval. The Russian Empire's collapse during the First World War, combined with widespread discontent and the catastrophic consequences of economic mismanagement and famine, provided the perfect storm for the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks established a one-party state, or dictatorship of the proletariat, with absolute control over political, social, and economic life. Propaganda became an essential tool of governance, terror, an instrument of compliance, and centralized planning, the foundation of a society being reshaped in the image of communist ideology. By 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had been formally established, consolidating the remnants of the old empire into a new geopolitical entity, whose influence would grow steadily across Eastern Europe and beyond. Stalin, Lenin's successor, would take this project further, transforming the Soviet Union from an agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse, albeit at immense human cost. The expansion of the Gulag system, forced labor, purges, and man-made famines left millions dead. But the world beyond the Iron Curtain remained largely unaware of the scale of suffering within the Soviet Union, seeing instead a nation that had maintained employment, industrialized rapidly, and resisted the tide of fascist aggression during the Second World War. In contrast, the Western world, and particularly the United States, approached the post-war period with a combination of triumph, anxiety, and a renewed sense of purpose. Having suffered relatively minimal territorial destruction and loss of life, the United States emerged with its industrial base intact, its economy invigorated by wartime production, and its military unmatched. The attack on Pearl Harbor, however, had shattered the nation's long-standing isolationist tendencies, leaving Americans with the sobering realization that even the vast expanse of the Pacific could not insulate them from global conflict. Political leaders, most notably President Franklin D. Roosevelt, sought to create structures capable of preventing another war, including the League of Nations, and later the United Nations. Economic reconstruction was prioritized, and financial institutions such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund were established to stabilize global markets and promote recovery. Yet while the United States sought to shape a post-war order based on liberal democracy and open markets, the Soviet Union pursued a parallel vision predicated on security through control of neighboring territories, the establishment of pro-Soviet governments, and the consolidation of influence in Eastern Europe, creating what would become known as the Eastern Bloc. The contrasting wartime experiences of the United States and the Soviet Union would further deepen the ideological divide. The USSR had borne the brunt of the Nazi onslaught, suffering tens of millions of casualties, devastating infrastructure losses, and the obliteration of entire communities. The Red Army's struggle was characterized by unimaginable sacrifice, relentless pressure, and the constant threat of annihilation. The United States, by contrast, engaged in a war that, while intense and global in scope, had spared the mainland from occupation or total devastation. Fewer than 500,000 Americans had perished, and the economy had flourished under the demands of total war. Yet both powers emerged with a shared understanding of the catastrophic potential of modern weaponry, especially nuclear arms, and the necessity of preparing for a future in which such destructive capabilities could dictate the terms of diplomacy, coercion, and survival. As Europe rebuilt from the rubble of bombed cities and shattered economies, political leaders navigated a complex web of alliances, threats, and ideological ambitions. Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman, faced the dual challenges of continuing the war effort in the Pacific and managing the rapidly evolving balance of power in Europe. Stalin's ambitions, particularly his insistence on control over Eastern Europe and the imposition of Soviet-aligned governments, collided with Truman's insistence on self-determination, democratic governance, and the containment of communist expansion. The Potsdam Conference of 1945, held in the wake of Germany's surrender, crystallized the geopolitical rift, with the Allies dividing Germany into occupation zones while simultaneously establishing a framework for the reconstruction of Europe that would inadvertently lay the groundwork for the continent's enduring division. In Asia, the conclusion of the war brought similar challenges. Japan, occupied and restructured under General Douglas MacArthur, underwent profound political, social, and economic reforms. A new constitution renounced war, instituted democratic governance, and promoted civil liberties and women's rights. China, meanwhile, fell to communist forces under Mao Zedong, establishing the People's Republic of China in 1949 and signaling the expansion of communist influence into East Asia. Korea, divided along the 38th parallel, became a flashpoint as the ideological struggle extended into proxy conflicts, culminating in the Korean War, which underscored the global reach and intensity of the Cold War, even in regions previously deemed peripheral. Simultaneously, the United States confronted domestic and international pressures in its efforts to contain communism. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the establishment of NATO, and a series of covert operations orchestrated by the CIA exemplified the lengths to which American policymakers were willing to go to counter perceived communist threats, both in Europe and the developing world. From Iran to Guatemala, the Congo to Southeast Asia, the United States engaged in interventions, coups, and support for pro-Western regimes, often at odds with its stated ideals of democracy and self-determination, yet justified under the strategic imperative of containment. Across the globe, the Soviet Union similarly leveraged its resources, ideology, and intelligence networks to maintain control over its satellite states, project power, and challenge American influence. Leaders like Khrushchev navigated the fine line between progressive reforms, such as the denunciation of Stalinist abuses, and aggressive displays of power, including military interventions in Hungary and confrontations over Berlin. The space race, nuclear weapons proliferation, and the establishment of military alliances, such as the Warsaw Pact, reflected the multifaceted and escalating nature of the Cold War, in which technological, psychological, and political factors were as crucial as traditional military might. The post-war decades thus became defined by a continuous and complex struggle for dominance, influence, and security. Every decision, whether diplomatic, military, or economic, carried with it the potential to trigger escalation or force compromise. Proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and ideological campaigns became the tools through which the superpowers sought to extend their reach, shape the global order, and deter the other side from achieving strategic advantage. In this environment, the ordinary lives of millions were impacted, from displaced populations in Europe and Asia to workers, students, and political activists navigating the competing pressures of capitalist and communist visions for society. The Cold War was, in essence, a conflict that permeated every aspect of the 20th century, redefining the nature of power, sovereignty, and human ambition. It was a battle fought not just on battlefields or in parliaments, but within the hearts, minds, and daily lives of people across the globe. It demanded strategic ingenuity, resilience, and a profound understanding of both the potential for human achievement and the capacity for human destruction. From the ashes of a world war, a new, complex struggle had emerged, a war unlike any that had preceded it, where victory was measured not by territory alone, but by influence, ideology, and the ability to shape the future of nations, societies, and civilizations themselves. These early years of the Cold War were marked by a constant interplay of deterrence, diplomacy, and ideological propaganda, as both superpowers sought to stabilize and expand their respective visions of the world. In the United States, a new era of political vigilance and widespread concern took hold, where fear of communist infiltration touched every facet of public life. Senators like Joseph McCarthy exploited the growing anxiety over a global communist conspiracy to advance their own careers, while Hollywood, universities, and media institutions fell under strict scrutiny. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union responded with a combination of rigid control, internal repression, and technological ambition, relying on intelligence agencies, satellite states, and an ever-expanding military to secure Moscow's growing influence. Yet the front lines were never solely military or political. The ideologies shaping the Cold War penetrated deeply into societies, influencing culture, education, economies, and even everyday life. Propaganda campaigns, public messaging, and education curricula became powerful tools to mold public opinion, emphasizing either the virtues of capitalism and democracy or the righteousness of socialism and proletarian revolution. As the United States promoted the narrative of freedom, opportunity, and economic prosperity, the Soviet Union underscored collective responsibility, equality, and the inevitability of historical progress under communism. This ideological struggle was mirrored in almost every corner of the globe, from reconstruction efforts in Europe to decolonizing regions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where local leaders often had to navigate the competing pressures of the two superpowers. The reconstruction of Europe, particularly through the Marshall Plan, demonstrated the United States' belief in economic revival as a form of security, while the Soviet Union's insistence on creating a buffer of compliant governments in Eastern Europe highlighted its own strategy of control and deterrence. The contrast could not have been starker. One side aimed to rebuild nations into partners capable of independent growth under Western democratic ideals, while the other sought to reshape societies into instruments of centralized state power, subordinating individual freedoms to the collective vision of socialism. In practice, These approaches often led to dramatic consequences for ordinary people, from the ideological purges and forced labor campaigns in the East to the fear-driven loyalty tests, blacklists, and political trials in the West. At the same time, the competition extended far beyond politics or military strategy. Technological innovation became a key arena of influence. Both powers sought supremacy in fields as diverse as nuclear weapons, rocketry, aviation, and eventually space exploration. Scientific research, universities, and industrial production were mobilized in ways that blurred the line between civilian and military priorities. The race for knowledge was, in effect, a race for global credibility. Achievements such as the Soviet launch of Sputnik or the American Manhattan Project were not simply technological milestones. They were demonstrations of capability, intent, and the promise of ideological dominance. The psychological effect on populations could not be underestimated, as ordinary citizens became acutely aware of the destructive power and political stakes held by nations thousands of miles away. In this environment, the lines between allies and adversaries grew increasingly complicated. Former enemies during the Second World War became reluctant partners or cautious observers, their choices constrained by geography, economics, or ideology. Countries in the global South, recently freed from colonial rule, emerged as critical battlegrounds for influence, with both superpowers vying to secure loyalty, resources, and strategic advantage. Some leaders skillfully played both sides to extract benefits, while others became pawns in proxy conflicts that often left societies devastated, economies crippled, and populations traumatized. Each intervention, coup, or economic program carried consequences that could resonate for decades, reinforcing the notion that the Cold War was not confined to Europe or North America. It was, in essence, global. As the 1,950 seconds progressed, the United States consolidated alliances through NATO and extended its influence with economic programs, while the Soviet Union built the Warsaw Pact and strengthened its control over the Eastern Bloc. The ideological struggle intensified with each diplomatic confrontation, secret intelligence operation, and regional conflict. The world's attention shifted constantly, from the streets of post-war Berlin to the mountains of Korea, from the factories of Italy to the rice paddies of Vietnam. With each crisis, the stakes grew higher, the consequences more immediate, and the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation loomed ever larger. Yet amid this tension, both sides cultivated the belief that the world order depended on their ability to project strength, maintain loyalty, and control the narrative. As the decade drew to a close, new leaders and emerging crises ensured that the Cold War would continue to evolve in unpredictable ways. The ideological struggle had already transformed economies, societies, and international relations. But the human stories behind these events of fear, ambition, courage, and compromise remained largely untold. It became increasingly clear that the Cold War was as much about perception as reality, as much about psychological dominance as physical control. And as nations prepared for the next chapter, the world stood on the brink of technological revolutions, political upheavals, and global confrontations that would continue to define the era for decades to come. In the shadows of this unfolding struggle, Ordinary people tried to live their lives, unaware that their daily routines, their education, and even their leisure were shaped by forces far beyond their comprehension. In towns and villages, cities and farms, children played while adults worked, laughed, and worried, all under the silent weight of an invisible war. The Cold War, though waged in the realm of spies, missiles, and diplomacy, ultimately touched every human life, shaping the culture, identity, and aspirations of generations yet to come. And as both superpowers prepared to extend their influence into the next decade, the world would once again see the fragile line between peace and conflict tested in ways that were unprecedented, unpredictable, and profoundly human. As the Cold War moved into the mid-1950s, the geopolitical map became a patchwork of spheres of influence, with each superpower asserting dominance through a combination of coercion, economic leverage, and military presence. In Europe, the scars of the Second World War were still visible, with bombed-out cities, ruined infrastructure, and displaced populations providing both a challenge and an opportunity for ideological expansion. The United States, through the Marshall Plan, funneled vast sums of aid to rebuild Western Europe, reinforcing capitalist economies while promoting democratic governance and market stability. Factories were rebuilt, ports restored, and transportation networks modernized. But these improvements were not purely altruistic. They represented a strategic bulwark against the spread of communism, a tangible demonstration that a society structured around freedom, private enterprise, and political plurality could achieve prosperity. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union consolidated its hold over Eastern Europe, creating a tightly controlled bloc of satellite states, each bound to Moscow by treaties, military presence, and political oversight. In countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, communist regimes enforced ideological conformity, nationalizing industries, collectivizing agriculture, and quashing dissent, with a combination of propaganda, secret police, and targeted purges. Public life was reshaped to reflect the supremacy of the Communist Party, and education, media, and culture were harnessed to indoctrinate loyalty, while simultaneously fostering a sense of unity under the socialist ideal. This rigid control created a stark contrast with the more open societies in the West, where debate, political opposition, and personal freedom remained visible, even if challenged by fear of communist infiltration and McCarthyist paranoia. Espionage became a defining feature of the era, as intelligence agencies like the CIA and KGB expanded operations to gather information, influence foreign governments, and disrupt adversaries' plans. The United States developed networks across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, embedding agents in embassies, universities, and industrial centers, while simultaneously supporting covert operations to prevent communist victories in elections or uprisings. In Iran, the 1953 CIA orchestrated coup against Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh demonstrated the lengths to which Washington would go to protect oil interests and prevent potential Soviet influence, replacing him with the pro-Western Shah. Similar operations unfolded in Guatemala, the Congo, and elsewhere, showcasing a global willingness to intervene where ideological stakes aligned with American strategic interests. The Soviet Union, in parallel, invested heavily in its intelligence network, placing spies in critical locations across Western Europe and North America. The infamous penetration of the Manhattan Project revealed not only the sophistication of Soviet espionage, but also the vulnerability of even the most guarded programs. These operations allowed Moscow to accelerate its nuclear ambitions, bridging technological gaps and ensuring that by the late 1942, it could match the United States in atomic capability. Such intelligence efforts became both a shield and a sword, enabling the Soviets to anticipate Western moves while simultaneously creating uncertainty, paranoia, and a constant tension that defined everyday political calculations on both sides. The nuclear dimension of the Cold War added an unprecedented psychological weight to global affairs. The United States, having demonstrated its power in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, initially enjoyed a monopoly. But the Soviet Union's successful atomic tests in 1949 shattered this advantage, compelling a rapid escalation in weapons development. Thermonuclear weapons, far more destructive than their predecessors, were pursued aggressively, with both nations investing in delivery systems, early warning networks, and command and control structures designed to ensure the ability to retaliate in the event of a first strike. The very existence of these weapons reshaped international diplomacy. Every negotiation, every standoff, every regional conflict had to be evaluated through the lens of potential nuclear escalation, a constant undercurrent that shaped strategies and constrained actions. While Europe became the primary theater of tension, Asia emerged as another crucial stage for Cold War dynamics. The aftermath of Japan's defeat left a power vacuum, with China experiencing civil war between nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek and communist forces under Mao Zedong. By 1949, Mao's victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China marked a significant expansion of communist influence, creating a strategic partnership with the Soviet Union and alarming American policymakers. Korea, divided along the 38th parallel, became the first proxy battlefield of the Cold War when Kim Il-sung, backed by Stalin and inspired by Mao, invaded the South in 1950. The United States, operating under the aegis of the United Nations, intervened to defend South Korea, resulting in a brutal 3-year conflict marked by high casualties, shifting front lines, and the eventual stalemate that preserved the division of the peninsula. This war not only tested military capabilities but also reinforced the principle of containment, proving to both superpowers that ideological expansion could be resisted, albeit at enormous human cost. In addition to conventional warfare, technology and the promise of space became central to the Cold War narrative. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 was a seismic psychological event, signaling not merely the ability to place a satellite in orbit, but also the potential for long-range ballistic missiles capable of delivering nuclear payloads across continents. The United States responded with the creation of NASA, the acceleration of rocket and missile programs, and an education and research push to cultivate scientists and engineers capable of maintaining technological parity. This period saw the emergence of the space race, with each side vying to demonstrate not only military and technological superiority, but also the intellectual and moral legitimacy of their respective systems. In classrooms, research labs, and military installations, young minds were mobilized in the pursuit of satellite launches, orbital missions, and eventually human spaceflight, a global competition that merged ideology with science in ways unprecedented in human history. The Cold War was equally fought in subtler arenas, from cultural influence to economic aid. Western nations promoted the appeal of consumer abundance, cultural freedom, and prosperity, emphasizing a lifestyle grounded in personal choice, leisure, and material comfort. Films, music, literature, and radio became conduits for ideological messaging, broadcasting visions of the good life under capitalism to global audiences. The Soviet Union, for its part, emphasized education, industrial achievement, and collective accomplishment, presenting images of orderly, disciplined societies where equality, social services, and industrial progress were held as superior values. Both sides understood that winning hearts and minds could be as decisive as winning battles, that perception could shape allegiance, and that the broader struggle for global influence required more than tanks, planes, and missiles. It demanded narrative supremacy. By the late 1952s, these competing pressures had created a world perpetually on edge, where every political summit, military exercise, and intelligence report carried enormous implications. Regions such as the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Latin America became theaters where ideological, economic, and strategic interests intersected, producing coups, revolutions, and conflicts that were often misaligned with the aspirations of local populations. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exemplified this dynamic, with Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser skillfully leveraging superpower rivalry to assert national sovereignty while gaining international recognition. Both the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves negotiating indirectly through local actors, illustrating the complex interplay between global strategy and regional agency. Amid this global chessboard, the human dimension of the Cold War remained ever present. Ordinary citizens navigated daily life under the shadow of uncertainty, with families, workers, and students living with the knowledge that political, military, and technological developments thousands of miles away could reshape their existence overnight. Education systems were aligned with national priorities. Media outlets became tools for shaping perception, and participation in civic life was often measured against ideological loyalty. This pervasive climate of awareness, fear, and hope fostered a generation acutely conscious of the power dynamics around them, one that would grow up expecting crises, negotiating tension, and witnessing the delicate balance of deterrence firsthand. As the first decade of the Cold War drew to a close, it became clear that the ideological, technological, and geopolitical contest was far from static. Leadership changes, domestic pressures, and evolving strategies would continuously alter the trajectory of global events. New crises, from the construction of the Berlin Wall to emerging conflicts in Southeast Asia, would test the limits of diplomacy, military capability, and public patience. The stage was set for an era in which both superpowers would simultaneously cooperate, compete, and confront one another, with each action, miscalculation, or display of strength carrying the weight of potential catastrophe. The narrative of the Cold War, already complex and far-reaching, was only beginning to unfold, and the next chapters would see the world pushed to the brink of both unprecedented technological achievement and unparalleled existential danger. In this context, the early Cold War was not merely a struggle between nations or leaders. It was a crucible in which the modern world would be forged. It was a period that tested ideology, morality, and ambition, a time when decisions made in distant capitals could reverberate across continents, shaping economies, societies, and the very course of history. As the world approached the 1,960 seconds, the pressures of ideological rivalry, nuclear deterrence, and technological competition would intensify, setting the stage for events that would define generations and underscore the fragile, precarious nature of peace in a world dominated by superpowers. And in the shadows of these grand maneuvers, countless lives, soldiers, civilians, politicians, and intellectuals alike, were caught in the tides of a struggle that would leave an indelible mark on history, reminding humanity that power, fear, and hope often move together in unpredictable, consequential ways. By the early 1960 seconds, the Cold War had become an intricate tapestry of confrontation, competition, and covert maneuvering. The world had settled into a tense equilibrium, in which any regional conflict could ripple outward with global consequences. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution had succeeded in overthrowing the American-backed Batista regime, fundamentally altering the strategic calculus in the Western Hemisphere. Initially, the United States attempted to contain Castro through economic sanctions, trade embargoes, and covert actions orchestrated by the CIA. The infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, designed to overthrow the Cuban leader with a force of CIA-trained exiles, ended in disaster. Within 3 days, the operation collapsed, humiliating the Kennedy administration and strengthening Castro's position at home. This failure also sent a clear signal to the Soviet Union that the United States' willingness to intervene in the Caribbean had limitations, emboldening Nikita Khrushchev to pursue more assertive measures. The Cold War's nuclear dimension became vividly apparent in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when American reconnaissance planes detected Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The world teetered on the brink of catastrophe. For 13 days, President Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in a tense standoff, communicating through letters, back channels, and public statements. The United States imposed a naval quarantine around Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles, while the Soviets insisted on guarantees that the U.S. would not invade the island. Secret negotiations, coupled with the simultaneous removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, eventually diffused the confrontation. But the episode illustrated the terrifying reality that nuclear miscalculation could instantly escalate into global annihilation. The crisis left an enduring legacy. Both superpowers realized that direct confrontation carried existential risks, leading to the establishment of a Moscow-Washington hotline and early arms control agreements, designed to reduce the chance of accidental nuclear war. Meanwhile, Southeast Asia had become a major theater of ideological and military contest. The French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the subsequent Geneva Accords divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with the Communist North under Ho Chi Minh and the anti-Communist South led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The United States, adhering to the principle of containment, committed to supporting South Vietnam economically, politically, and militarily, fearing that a communist takeover would trigger a domino effect throughout the region. Covert operations, military advisors, and strategic planning were initiated, setting the stage for a prolonged engagement that would ultimately escalate into full-scale conflict by the mid-1960s. Laos, Cambodia, and other nations in Indochina also became arenas of proxy warfare, with communist and anti-communist factions battling for dominance, often with foreign backing, that intensified the human and economic costs of local conflicts. Espionage continued to evolve as both superpowers recognized its critical role in shaping the trajectory of the Cold War. The CIA expanded operations across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, orchestrating coups, funding anti-communist political movements, and gathering intelligence on military developments. The KGB, meanwhile, strengthened its domestic control and international espionage capabilities, infiltrating Western scientific communities, government institutions, and even the highest echelons of military command. Spy networks, double agents, and counterintelligence operations became central to strategic planning, as each side sought to anticipate and preempt the other's moves. High-profile cases, such as the exposure of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, revealed the devastating consequences of espionage for national security and public perception, while simultaneously feeding fear and paranoia within civilian populations. The nuclear arms race accelerated relentlessly. Both superpowers pursued increasingly sophisticated weapons systems, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and thermonuclear devices of staggering destructive potential. Military strategists developed elaborate doctrines of mutually assured destruction, MAD, recognizing that any first strike would provoke an equally catastrophic retaliation. Civil defense measures, such as fallout shelters, emergency drills, and civil preparedness campaigns, became commonplace in Western countries, embedding the constant awareness of nuclear threat into everyday life. Simultaneously, technological innovation was harnessed to develop early warning satellites, radar networks, and intelligence-gathering capabilities, with the space race serving both as a symbolic demonstration of superiority and a practical testing ground for missile technology. Cultural and ideological warfare was another critical front. The United States promoted images of prosperity, consumer abundance, and personal freedom, broadcasting them worldwide through radio, cinema, literature, and magazines. The Soviets countered with narratives of equality, industrial achievement, and collective solidarity, presenting socialist societies as moral and economic alternatives to capitalist decadence. Education, arts, and media were mobilized to shape public opinion, with each side attempting to influence not only foreign populations, but also its own citizens. Propaganda became an art form, combining subtle persuasion with overt messaging, and often targeting the emotional and psychological dimensions of ideology as much as the rational or material. Africa and the Middle East emerged as critical arenas of competition, where colonial legacies, resource wealth, and strategic location intersected with superpower rivalry. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser skillfully leveraged Cold War dynamics to assert national sovereignty, initially securing funding for the Aswan High Dam from the United States, then turning to the Soviet Union when political tensions arose. His nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 provoked a military response from Britain, France, and Israel. But US and Soviet pressure forced a retreat, highlighting the growing independence of post-colonial states while demonstrating the limits of Western military power. Meanwhile, in Iran, the 1953 CIA-backed coup reinforced anti-Western sentiment for decades, sowing the seeds of future conflict and illustrating the long-term consequences of interventionist policies. Similar patterns unfolded across Latin America and the Caribbean, where political instability, economic dependence, and ideological alignment created opportunities for both superpowers to exert influence, often with consequences that would resonate for generations. In Europe, the Berlin Wall, constructed in 1961, became the most visible symbol of the Cold War's division. It physically separated East and West Berlin, embodying the ideological, political, and economic chasm between communist and capitalist worlds. Families were torn apart, citizens restricted, and the flow of knowledge, people, and resources tightly controlled. The wall's construction underscored the extent to which regimes would go to preserve power and demonstrated that ideological competition was not merely theoretical. It shaped the daily lives of millions in concrete, tangible ways. Throughout this period, leadership dynamics played a crucial role in the Cold War's trajectory. Figures such as John F. Kennedy, Nikita Khrushchev, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and later Lyndon B. Johnson and Leonid Brezhnev made decisions that reverberated globally, influencing military strategy, economic policy, and diplomatic negotiations. Personality, ideology, and perception intermingled with structural forces, creating a complex web in which miscalculation, miscommunication, or bold initiative could spark crises or avert them. The balance of power was fragile, requiring constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and, often, a degree of calculated risk. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War had evolved into a multidimensional struggle encompassing military, technological, economic, cultural, and ideological arenas. Proxy wars proliferated, intelligence networks expanded, nuclear arsenals grew ever more formidable, and the global population became increasingly aware that ordinary life existed under the shadow of extraordinary power. Each action, from covert operations in distant continents to missile deployments in Europe, contributed to a pervasive tension that would shape not only international relations, but also the very structure of societies, the aspirations of individuals, and the possibilities for peace and conflict in the decades to come. The narrative of the Cold War, already intricate and expansive, had moved far beyond a simple East versus West dichotomy. It had become a struggle over the very nature of modernity, governance, and human progress. With each superpower seeking to demonstrate the superiority of its system while simultaneously undermining the other. It was a contest in which ideology, technology, military might, and cultural influence intertwined, producing a world in which caution and audacity, diplomacy and brinkmanship, faith and fear all coexisted. And yet, despite the pervasive tension and the threat of nuclear annihilation, life continued. Societies adapted, economies grew, technological achievements inspired awe, and individuals navigated the precarious balance between opportunity and danger. The Cold War was not a static conflict. It was a dynamic, evolving process that tested every dimension of human organization and ambition. With each passing year, new crises emerged, new opportunities arose, and the world was reminded that history itself was in motion, shaped by choices, conflicts, and visions of what a society, a nation, or a world could become. When American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Soviet missiles in Cuba in October 1962, President John F. Kennedy acted swiftly, convening a special Security Council, effectively an ExComm, to manage the escalating crisis. Although there were calls for an immediate invasion of the island, Kennedy was cautious, understanding that the covert presence of 42,000 Soviet troops armed with short-range nuclear weapons could escalate any U.S. assault into full-scale nuclear war. Opting for a more measured approach, he authorized a naval blockade to prevent additional Soviet shipments from reaching Cuba, signaling restraint while preparing for the worst. Just 2 days later, Soviet vessels approaching the blockade turned back, offering the first sign that Kennedy's strategy was effective. Yet tensions remained high as missile sites neared completion. U.S. forces stationed in Florida reached a state of maximum readiness, with 140,000 troops on alert, bombers on continuous high alert, and nearly 150 intercontinental ballistic missiles prepped for potential launch, as DEFCON 2, the highest peacetime nuclear alert, was declared. The threat of annihilation loomed over both superpowers, and negotiations became critical. Through painstaking diplomacy, aided by Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy offered Khrushchev a deal: the removal of Soviet missiles in Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island, and the eventual secret removal of Jupiter missiles from Italy and Turkey. The crisis nearly escalated to catastrophe when, on October 27th, a Soviet submarine, harried by U.S. signaling depth charges, came dangerously close to launching a nuclear torpedo, only to be restrained by Officer Vasily Arkhipov, whose refusal single-handedly prevented nuclear war. The following day, Khrushchev agreed to Kennedy's terms, ending the Cuban Missile Crisis and establishing a direct hotline between Washington and Moscow to reduce the risk of future miscommunications. The aftermath profoundly influenced U.S. defense policy. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, much like Eisenhower before him, concluded that planning exclusively for total nuclear war paradoxically offered the best chance to prevent it. This philosophy gave rise to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, in which both sides prepared to inflict maximum casualties on enemy cities, deliberately avoiding missile defenses to maintain equilibrium. The Soviet Union eventually concurred, culminating in the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which prohibited defenses against long-range missiles. Meanwhile, the CIA continued its relentless, often absurdly imaginative attempts to remove Fidel Castro, launching hundreds of assassination plots, ranging from exploding cigars to poisoned diving suits, demonstrating the extremes of Cold War intrigue. As the Cuban crisis receded, the United States' attention turned to Southeast Asia, where the Vietnam conflict had intensified. Despite years of U.S. aid to the South Vietnamese regime, President Ngo Dinh Diem proved an oppressive and ineffective leader, prompting CIA involvement in his 1963 assassination. Kennedy himself was assassinated shortly thereafter, leaving Lyndon B. Johnson to confront a deteriorating situation in Vietnam. Guided by the domino theory, Johnson escalated American involvement. Yet despite overwhelming military power, the insurgency endured. The 1,968 Tet Offensive shocked the U.S. public as North Vietnamese forces simultaneously attacked over 100 cities, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, shattering the illusion that victory was imminent and giving rise to the term credibility gap, reflecting the widening divergence between government assertions and battlefield realities. Anti-war protests erupted domestically and internationally, culminating in a particularly violent year in the U.S., marked by the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, political unrest, and rising public skepticism over American foreign policy. President Richard Nixon would inherit an increasingly unwinnable conflict, and his secret invasion of Cambodia in 1970 sparked further domestic turmoil, exemplified by the Kent State shootings, while U.S. withdrawal by 1973 failed to prevent the eventual communist victory in South Vietnam, leaving more than 3 million Vietnamese dead alongside tens of thousands of American casualties. Neighboring Laos and Cambodia also succumbed to communist control, with Cambodia's Pol Pot orchestrating a brutal genocide that claimed up to 2 million lives, illustrating the devastating human cost of Cold War proxy wars. Meanwhile, the Sino-Soviet split deepened, as Mao Zedong condemned Khrushchev's de-Stalinization as dangerous revisionism, continuing his own draconian policies in China, including collectivization failures, the disastrous Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution. These policies, combined with droughts and famine, produced one of the deadliest humanitarian crises in history, with tens of millions perishing between 1958 and 1962. Relations between Moscow and Beijing would deteriorate further, culminating in the 1969 border conflict that brought the two communist powers perilously close to war. Seizing diplomatic opportunities, Nixon visited China in 1972, laying the groundwork for improved U.S.-China relations, while simultaneously leveraging the growing Sino-Soviet rift in Cold War strategy. Within the Soviet Union, leadership transitions and policy reversals defined the era. Khrushchev's ousting in 1964 brought Leonid Brezhnev to power, inaugurating an 18-year period, later termed the Era of Stagnation, characterized by centralized bureaucracy, corruption, economic inertia, and political suppression. Attempts at reform were crushed, as seen in the Prague Spring of 1968, when Alexander Dubček's liberalizing initiatives in Czechoslovakia were violently suppressed by 250,000 Warsaw Pact troops, reinforcing the Brezhnev doctrine that sought to maintain socialist orthodoxy in Eastern Europe. The contrast between Eastern and Western Europe became increasingly stark. The West experienced prosperity, economic integration, and rising living standards, exemplified by the Marshall Plan and the European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to the European Union. By contrast, citizens of the Eastern Bloc faced material scarcity, political repression, and surveillance, with the KGB tightly monitoring daily life. The 1970 seconds further tested Cold War dynamics. Nixon pursued détente with the USSR, resulting in the SALT I Treaty of 1972 and cautious cooperation in arms control. Yet proxy conflicts persisted, from Vietnam to Angola, while covert interventions in Chile brought General Pinochet to power after the overthrow of Salvador Allende. The Watergate scandal would eventually engulf Nixon, eroding public trust and underscoring the consequences of executive overreach in foreign and domestic affairs. Meanwhile, the Middle East erupted into conflict with the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, drawing Cold War powers into regional disputes and raising questions about the viability of détente. The Helsinki Accords of 1975 promised respect for human rights in Eastern Europe, inadvertently creating a platform for reformist movements that would later challenge communist regimes. The space race punctuated this period of geopolitical tension, with Soviet milestones such as Yuri Gagarin's orbital flight and the first spacewalk by Alexei Leonov contrasting with U.S. achievements like the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. While initially a tool of ideological competition, space exploration eventually became a symbol of potential cooperation, culminating in the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where U.S. and Soviet spacecraft docked in orbit, marking a high-water point for détente and demonstrating the possibilities of joint scientific endeavor even amid geopolitical rivalry. By the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, renewed Cold War tensions emerged. The Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the strategic buildup under President Reagan's peace through strength philosophy reinvigorated the arms race, with SDI, Star Wars, plans and aggressive defense spending, putting immense pressure on the already fragile Soviet economy. Reagan's policies, combined with economic reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping and internal stagnation within the USSR, set the stage for profound systemic change. The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, with his policies of perestroika and glasnost, introduced unprecedented transparency and reform, opening the door to democratization, criticism of the communist system, and ultimately, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. By the end of 1991, after failed coups, rising nationalism, and independence movements across the constituent republics, the USSR formally ceased to exist, bringing a definitive end to the Cold War, a conflict that had shaped global politics, economics, and society for more than 4 decades. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the geopolitical landscape of the world shifted dramatically, ushering in a new era defined less by superpower confrontation and more by regional conflicts, economic integration, and the rapid spread of technology. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, projecting influence through both military presence and global economic power, while the newly independent states of the former USSR, particularly Russia under Boris Yeltsin, struggled to transition from centrally planned economies to market-oriented systems. The 1,990 seconds were marked by economic upheaval in Russia, with widespread privatization often benefiting a small group of oligarchs, while ordinary citizens faced inflation, unemployment, and social instability. Yet, despite these challenges, Russia maintained nuclear capabilities and attempted to reassert influence in former Soviet territories, most notably in Chechnya, where brutal conflicts highlighted the tensions of a post-imperial transition. Elsewhere, the post-Cold War period saw the U.S. military engage in rapid, technologically sophisticated conflicts, exemplified by the Gulf War of 1991, when Iraq's invasion of Kuwait prompted a swift multinational response led by the United States under President George H.W. Bush. The war demonstrated the effectiveness of precision-guided munitions, integrated air-ground operations, and real-time intelligence, reshaping modern warfare and establishing the concept of shock and awe. Meanwhile, NATO expanded eastward, incorporating former Warsaw Pact states and solidifying the alliance's influence in Europe, while simultaneously provoking caution and resentment from Russia, which viewed the expansion as a strategic encroachment on its traditional sphere of influence. The 1,990 seconds were also defined by economic globalization, technological revolution, and the rise of the Internet. Former Cold War rivalries gave way to economic competition, with China accelerating its integration into global markets under Deng Xiaoping's reforms. By embracing foreign investment, manufacturing, and export-led growth, China transformed into a rising economic powerhouse, challenging U.S. dominance and reshaping global supply chains. Meanwhile, Europe deepened integration with the Maastricht Treaty of 1992, establishing the European Union and laying the foundation for the euro, creating a politically and economically cohesive bloc that would play a central role in regional and global affairs. Conflict did not disappear with the Cold War's end. Ethnic and religious tensions, previously suppressed or manipulated by superpower rivalries, erupted in various regions. The breakup of Yugoslavia led to a series of brutal wars in the Balkans, with ethnic cleansing campaigns in Bosnia and Kosovo, exposing the limitations of international institutions and prompting NATO-led interventions. In Africa, civil wars and humanitarian crises unfolded in Somalia, Rwanda, and Sierra Leone, with international responses ranging from peacekeeping missions to failed interventions, demonstrating the complex challenges of the post-Cold War security environment. Meanwhile, the Middle East remained a persistent flashpoint. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, was weakened but not eliminated after the Gulf War, and the rise of Islamist extremism, particularly in Afghanistan, following the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, set the stage for future conflicts. The 1990 seconds also saw the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a transnational threat, culminating in the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, signaling that global security challenges were evolving beyond the nation-state conflicts of the Cold War era. Technological advances continued to reshape society, with the proliferation of personal computers, the World Wide Web, mobile telecommunications, and satellite communications redefining economies, cultures, and politics. The diffusion of information accelerated global interconnectedness, empowering new social movements, reshaping political discourse, and altering the balance of economic power. Simultaneously, the end of bipolar competition allowed the U.S. to project soft power more effectively, using cultural influence, economic aid, and technological leadership to shape international norms and institutions. Yet, the legacy of the Cold War remained. Former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states navigated delicate independence while managing Russian influence. Nuclear proliferation became a central concern, particularly with North Korea and Pakistan developing weapons capabilities, and the rise of China presented a strategic counterbalance to unipolar American power. The international system, while ostensibly more cooperative, was marked by regional tensions, emerging threats, and the challenge of balancing sovereignty, intervention, and global governance in a rapidly changing world. As the century drew to a close, the post-Cold War era demonstrated both the opportunities and vulnerabilities of a world without clear superpower confrontation. Economic globalization accelerated. Technological innovation transformed societies, and U.S. dominance shaped the international order. But lingering conflicts, regional instability, and the rise of non-state actors underscored that while the ideological struggle of the Cold War had ended, the pursuit of security, influence, and stability remained as urgent and complex as ever. The 21st century would inherit this legacy, with the lessons of the past diplomacy, strategic restraint, and the management of nuclear and conventional power continuing to inform global politics in an era that was both unipolar and increasingly multipolar. The turn of the millennium brought with it new challenges and a world reshaped by technology, globalization, and lingering regional conflicts. In the United States, President Bill Clinton's administration oversaw a period of relative economic prosperity fueled by the dot-com boom. But the world was about to be confronted with a new form of global insecurity. On September 11, 2001, Islamist extremists associated with Al-Qaeda carried out coordinated attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing nearly 3,000 people and shattering the sense of invulnerability in the U.S. and the wider world. The attacks marked a decisive turning point, ushering in the era of the War on Terror, in which counterterrorism would dominate U.S. foreign policy for decades. The United States, under President George W. Bush, launched the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001, aiming to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban from power. This military campaign initially succeeded in toppling the Taliban regime, but Afghanistan soon descended into a protracted insurgency, complicated by ethnic divisions, drug trade, and regional power struggles. The 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, justified by claims of weapons of mass destruction and alleged ties to terrorism, further inflamed regional tensions. While Saddam Hussein was removed and eventually executed, the ensuing power vacuum led to civil conflict, the rise of sectarian militias, and the emergence of ISIS, a violent extremist organization that would terrorize Iraq, Syria, and beyond. During this period, technology continued to transform global politics and society. The rise of social media, smartphones, and ubiquitous internet access created new avenues for communication, activism, and disinformation. Traditional state power was challenged by non-state actors capable of influencing global events from the shadows. Simultaneously, economic globalization accelerated, with China continuing its meteoric rise. By the early 2010s, China had become the world's second-largest economy, wielding significant influence over trade, infrastructure projects, and financial systems worldwide. The Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, exemplified China's ambition to reshape the global economic landscape, extending influence across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Meanwhile, Russia, under Vladimir Putin, sought to reassert itself on the international stage. Using energy leverage, political influence, and military intervention, Russia demonstrated that despite the post-Cold War period of weakness, it remained a formidable actor. The 2008 invasion of Georgia, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine underscored Moscow's determination to reclaim regional influence and challenge Western dominance. NATO, having expanded eastward throughout the 1992s and 2000s, faced renewed strategic dilemmas, balancing defense commitments with the risk of direct confrontation with a resurgent Russia. In the Middle East, persistent instability continued to shape global politics. The Arab Spring of 2010-2012 ignited a wave of protests and uprisings across the region, toppling long-standing regimes in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. While the revolutions initially promised democratic reform, many states descended into civil war or authoritarian resurgence, particularly in Syria, where a brutal civil war created a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. ISIS exploited these conflicts, drawing fighters from across the globe and perpetrating acts of terror that reverberated worldwide. The Syrian conflict, combined with instability in Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, would dominate international security concerns and fuel mass migration, challenging both regional and Western governments. At the same time, technological and scientific advancements transformed warfare, communication, and economies. Drones, cyber operations, and precision-guided munitions became standard in military arsenals, while the global reach of social media allowed for the instantaneous spread of information, propaganda, and activism. Climate change emerged as a defining challenge of the 21st century, reshaping geopolitical priorities, migration patterns, and international cooperation. With rising temperatures, sea levels, and extreme weather events threatening economies and societies worldwide. By the 2010 seconds, a new era of multipolarity had emerged. The United States remained a dominant power, but it faced strategic competition from China, a resurgent Russia, and regional powers like India, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Cybersecurity became a central concern, with state and non-state actors engaging in hacking, disinformation campaigns, and economic espionage, illustrating the evolving nature of conflict in a hyper-connected world. Trade disputes, military posturing, and regional proxy conflicts highlighted the fragility of global stability, echoing the lessons of the Cold War, while demonstrating that ideological confrontation had been replaced by a complex matrix of economic, technological, and strategic competition. By the end of the decade, the world had become simultaneously more interconnected and more volatile. Globalization, technology, and the legacy of the Cold War created both opportunities for cooperation and the potential for conflict on scales previously unimaginable. The rise of new powers, the persistence of regional instability, and the emergence of transnational threats ensured that the lessons of the 20th century diplomacy, strategic deterrence, and the careful management of power remained as relevant as ever. The story of the Cold War and its aftermath is, in many ways, a story of continuity and change. While the ideological standoff of the 20th century ended, the structures, rivalries, and lessons it created continued to shape the world, influencing how nations approach power, security, and diplomacy. The 21st century would inherit a complex, interconnected, and technologically advanced world where old rivalries were replaced by new competitions and where the stakes human, economic, and strategic remained extraordinarily high.